Welcome to Chapter 8.5, The High and Late Middle Ages, A Time of Crisis. In the mid-1300s, there was a deadly disease called the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, which reached Europe. It was spread by fleas carried by rats and other animals, which eventually caused an epidemic to break out, killing 1/3 of all the Europeans. People were so terrified that normal life began to break down. People fled the cities or hid in their homes. Without workers, production declined. Survivors demanded higher wages, leading to something called inflation, or the rise of prices. Landlords tried to limit wages and forced villagers off the land. The plague not only spread death, but also spread social unrest, as bitter, angry peasants began to revolt. By the late Middle Ages, the church too was in a crisis, and many monks and priests had died during the plague. Survivors asked tough spiritual questions, and the church could not provide strong leadership that was needed. For about 70 years, a luxury-loving papal court ruled in Avignon, which is in France. Reformers arose within the church calling for change, and in 1378 they elected their own pope in Rome. The French cardinals elected a rival pope, and this church schism, or split, finally ended in 1417 when the church council removed authority from all the different popes that had been elected and comprised a new candidate. For most of this time, a destructive war was waged. Between 1337 and 1453, England and France had fought a series of battles known as the 100 Years' War. Both sides wanted control of lands in France that had once been England's, the English Channel, and that region for a monopoly on trade. England began by winning many early victories because of their new technology, which included the longbow. However, nearing the end, a 17-year-old girl named Joan of Arc helped to lead France into beginning to win battles. Joan had told the uncrowned king, Charles VII, that God sent her to save France, and so he authorized her to lead an army against the English. In 1 year, her troops won several key victories, but she was captured and sold to the English and tried as a witch and burned at the stake. Her martyrdom rallied French forces, and with their powerful new weapon, the cannon, they drove the English out of France. And ultimately, the war helped the French king to expand his own power. In England, it strengthened the Parliament. As Europe recovered from the plague, its population began to grow, and manufacturing expanded and trade increased. This set the stage for the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Age of Exploration. The plague seemed to have come to Europe in about 1347 from Asia, when a fleet of Genoese trading ships loaded with grain came from the Black Sea area, over here, and down to the ports of Sicily, here. Along the way, sailors had been getting sick and dying, and they did not know the reason why. But soon after the stop in Messina, which is a town in Sicily, townspeople started to get sick and die as well. And eventually, this raged all the way up the boot of Italy and into the northern part of Italy by 1348. And this became known as the Black Death. There have been many forms of plague. The Black Death is one type of plague, but there have been many different waves of plagues that have gone through the world. The bubonic plague had been seen in Europe, Asia, and North Africa earlier, but it had gone away after a while. There was a strain that broke out in Mongolia in the 1200s, and when the Mongols washed over Eastern Europe, they would be known to take plague bodies that had of victims of the plague and launch them into cities that they were sieging in order to supposedly cause the plague to break out in the city. The people of Europe and Asia did not know what actually caused the plague. They thought that it was possibly bad air or the wrath of God, but none of them made the connection that rats or fleas on rats would be the reason why the plague would be spreading. Medieval Christians would have been familiar with the plagues in the Bible, and these were seen as divine punishment from God. And so the medieval people believed that they were being punished for bad things, for things that they had done. As the plague kept reoccurring throughout the 1300s, the Europeans lost so many people that their economy began to plummet. It reached such a low state that I don't think it's reached that low ever since that point. The survivors were able to demand much higher wages because there were so few people to work. So this caused prices to start rising, and the price rise caused something called inflation. This is what happens when there's such a demand for the good that the people who are selling the good can demand a higher price for their goods. Those who had to pay wages, like landlords or merchants, tried to get the government to put a price cap on wages. Or they began to convert their properties into industries that required less labor, so like sheep farming, which was really terrible for the land, but it required much less labor to raise sheep than it did to raise wheat. Well, displaced laborers ended up moving to towns or cities in order to find jobs. And so this created tension within the towns, because now there's an influx of people looking for work, but there's not a lot of work that needs to be done, and so there's this caused unemployment, riots, and social unrest. Guilds felt threatened by the influx of labor, and so they tried to reduce the opportunities for people. And so the guilds were trying to gain more freedom and more power within the city limits. And this, coupled with their fear of the plague and new people coming in and possibly bringing plague, was a very potent combination. Because of people's fear of the plague, there were different ways that they tried to deal with that fear. So one way was by turning to charms and magic and trying to protect themselves with that kind of thing. Some of them abandoned themselves to pleasure because they felt like they had no hope and they were going to enjoy whatever time they had left. Some felt like they had sinned in some way, and so they would do self-punishment to try to placate God. And then some of them hid from all people. They became recluses, while others just went about their daily lives, hoping and praying that they would not be hit by the plague. One group of people that were spared from the plague were the Jews. And looking back on the Jews and how they were able to avoid the plague, we can see that the practice of the Old Testament laws helped them to have cleanliness habits that saved them from the plague. But the people of the Middle Ages looking at the Jewish populations would not have seen that. They would have distrusted their ability to avoid getting the plague. And this began a habit or a pattern of persecution against the Jews. It's interesting, looking back on the weather patterns of the early 1300s, there was severe famine going on, either too much rain or too little rain. So there were an unusual number of storms that brought torrential rains and ruined wheat, oat, and hay crops. And the poor harvests, there were about 1 in 4, were leading to a scarcity and starvation. So the terrible famine was happening between 1315 and 1317, and that lowered the resistance level of people. And then there was also a typhoid fever epidemic as well in about 1316, and in 1318 there was a cattle and sheep illness or sickness that went through all the animals, domesticated animals in Europe, and reduced the flocks considerably. So these there had, however, been huge amounts of land that had been cleared for cultivation during the late 1200s and early 1300s, but the amount of food that was increased in production was outdistanced by the population increase, and so people were still going hungry because there were too many people and not enough food. So theoretically, when the plague hit in the 1347, the population dramatically decreased, and so that did cut down on the pressure for or the competition for food. But now there was a lack of labor, and so fields went unharvested or unplowed, and so food became more scarce because there were not enough people to produce enough food. And so things started to really just shut down. And this caused, as we mentioned before, the labor cost went up because there were so few people who were able to work, and the cost of food went up as well. So people were struggling to survive. Priests, monks, and nuns cared for the sick and the dying and buried the dead. So they were the most affected by the plague. So all the ones who were doing the right thing and helping the poor and helping the sick were the ones who got the plague and eventually died, leaving the priests and monks and nuns who did not choose to serve in this way and probably were not as strict in their following of Christianity. And so this left the nuns and the monks and the priests who were not as holy or as good. Especially in Germany, in 1350s, the German priests were so devastated by the plague that the German church leadership often fell into the hands of weak and incompetent men. And so this was possibly one of the main reasons why the German church experienced a reformation sooner than other parts of Europe. But with such a devastating and unexplainable sweeping off of thousands of people, the big question was, why did God spare some and kill others? Because it was clear that God was the one in control of this terrible disease. And the question was he mad about something? And why was he mad? And who was he mad at? And how could they help placate God? That was the big question. Some men and women even went around whipping themselves with whips that had little bits of metal or glass in them in order to scourge themselves as penance for their own sin and their society's sin. They believed that the Black Death was God's punishment for humanity's sinfulness. And these men and women became known as flagellants. I better spell that for you, because flagellants also means having problems with gas, but so this is a different spelling. The spelling is Flagellants. But people in the Middle Ages during the plague often thought that it was the church that had caused the plague, because the church at this time was going through a horrendous upheaval and terrible things were happening within the church. The violent disputes of the church badly damaged the prestige of the Pope. The kings of both England and France had laid taxes on the clergy, and this caused a lot of anger from the Pope. Pope Boniface VIII was arguing that by precedent, kings should not be taxing church properties, and that he forbade his own churchmen to pay any of these taxes. But both kings of France and England refused to accept this decree, partly because it hurt their own finances and partly because the papal order threatened their royal authority over their countries. From 1309 to 1376, there were popes that lived in Avignon, France. And this period of church history is known as the Babylonian captivity. This is named after the Jewish Babylonian captivity. And it was a time period that really damaged the church's credibility with the people. During the time in France, the popes had concentrated on creating a bureaucracy rather than working on the spiritual life of the church. And so it was a well-run church, but it had no spiritual potency. Then in 1377, Pope Gregory XI brought the papal court back to Rome. But unfortunately, he died right after moving the court, and the Roman citizens demanded that the pope that an Italian pope be elected rather than a pope from, say, France or Germany or some other place. So they put pressure on the cardinals to elect an Italian pope. On April 7th, 1378, there were after two ballots, they decided unanimously to choose an Italian bishop, and he took the name Urban VI. Each of the cardinals swore that Urban had been elected sincerely, freely, genuinely. And his great aim was to abolish simony, which is the selling of church offices, and pluralism, which is having several different church offices at one time, or absenteeism, which is where you never visit the area that you are supposed to be in charge of, or any kind of extravagance or ostentation. So now church leaders were supposed to wear more plain clothing, etc. Unfortunately, Pope Urban went about the work with a lot of force, and he got a lot of people angry with him. He threatened to excommunicate cardinals who were not taking his advice or who were not following directions, and he said that what they were doing was worthy of excommunication. Well, that got people very angry, and eventually he himself was told to step down out of his office as Pope. His quick temper and irrational behavior kind of made him a unsuccessful Pope. Instead, they chose the King Charles V's cousin, who became known as Clement VII. And Charles V's cousin was chosen as well as a French pope who was also on the throne. And this two popes ended up being called the Great Schism, which means the Great Split. The word schism, S-C-H-I-S-M, means a division between one thing. Though eventually the church figured out its pope problem, there were a lot of people who were still very unsatisfied with the church. They questioned the morals and the lavish lifestyle of the church leaders. And some of these people became the precursors for the Reformation. Two notable figures were John Wycliffe in England, a professor at Oxford University, who eventually preached that the Bible was enough and that the church interpretation of the Bible was not necessary and that people should read the Bible for themselves. And he went a step farther and translated the Bible into English, the first English translation of the Bible. Well, the church was very anti having the Bible in the vernacular, and so all of his any copy that they could find, they snatched up and burned. But unfortunately, John Wycliffe had already died by that point, and at the next council that they held, his bones were dug up and they were burned along with many of his books. But the other precursor to the Reformation was a man named John Huss. So John, what a popular name. If that's on the test, if the question is asked whether what the name of a reformer is, if you put John as the first name, you'll probably get it right. So the second precursor of the Reformation is John Huss. He was from Bohemia, or what is today, present day, the Czech Republic. And he was also a professor. He was the academic or the dean of student life of the University of Prague. And he would preach, and he would, because as a professor, he was also ordained as a priest. And he would often tell the people that it was through faith alone that they were saved, and that the Bible was a good thing to read. And so he was seen as a heretic as well. And he, unfortunately, was living during this the council that was called. And so, along with John Wycliffe's bones, John Huss was burnt at the stake. In 1337, war broke out between the two strongest nations in Europe, England and France. And it was basically over land. The English thought that they should own land in France because the English, several English kings had ancestry that was French. This was a war in which public opinion mattered a lot. Even though there were many other reasons why the war was fought, the people of both France and England believed that, England believed that the rightful king of France should be their king, King Edward III. And so he was being denied his crown by this usurper over in France, and so they were all going to go help him win this crown for England. And on the other side, it was portrayed as this English ruffian who was invading France and trying to take away the rightful throne from the French king. So it was, both sides were being propagandized. This may even be when the rivalry between France and England began, but it has certainly continued on even till today. But the 100 Years' War was extremely popular with the populations of England because the poor knights were given opportunities for gaining more power and glory, and they even enlisted criminals and other vagabonds into the armed forces, and it gave men an opportunity to gain more prestige and wealth. During the war's early stages, England was highly successful. English longbowmen scored a lot of victories over the French knights and crossbowmen. A crossbow is extremely difficult to load. It takes a lot of power and effort. In fact, they often used winches to try to restring the crossbow so that it could be fired again. So although the fire of a longbow wasn't very accurate or very powerful compared to the crossbow, the longbow could be reloaded very rapidly, and so English archers could send off about 3 arrows to the French crossbowman's 1 arrow. And as a result, the English were able to unhorse French knights and cause a lot of confusion, and they also used cannon, probably for the first time, as an artillery weapon. And this created mass panic. The English horsemen would then go in after all of this shooting had been done, and they'd just basically butcher French knights. Well, the English were successful at the Battle of Poitiers, and again at the Battle of Agincourt, where they were greatly outnumbered by the French, and their leader, the soldier King Henry V, gained the field over of hugely superior French. Joan of Arc is thought to be the savior of the French monarchy. She was born in 1412 to well-to-do peasants in a village called Dormay-Champagne, and Joan of Arc grew up in a very religious household. But during her adolescence, she began to hear voices, which she later claimed were Saint Michael or Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret. In 1428, these voices were telling her with great urgency that the Dauphin, who would later be crowned Charles VII, had to be crowned, and that the English needed to be expelled from France. She went to the French court and persuaded the king that he needed her support. And on April 28th, 1429, she was marched out onto the battlefield with the troops. She didn't know anything about warfare. She was only 17 years old, but she believed that she could help give the troops a encouragement. And so the English on May 8th were forced to retreat out of Orleans, probably more because of disease and lack of supplies than because of the superior military strength of the French. But 10 days later, Charles VII was crowned at the city of Reims, and these are the two events that mark the turning point of the 100 Years' War in favor of the French. So in the 1430s, Joan of Arc was captured by the English allies, the Burgundians, and she was turned over to the English, and they in turn turned her over to an ecclesiastical court, or a court run by church officials, where she was accused of sorcery and burnt at the stake. But later, she was given another trial by the French courts, and she was exonerated from that accusation. So, if you go to France today, you will see that she is one of France's two patron saints. Well, the impact of the 100 Years' War was that England lost its territory in France, and the French kings ended up expanding their power over other French nobility, so that there was a very strong monarchy as opposed to such a weak monarchy that there had been before the 100 Years' War. England's parliament also became more powerful back in England because they controlled the purse strings, and the kings had to come to parliament if they wanted to conduct war, because parliament was going to be paying for it. England's rulers decided to turn their attention to more financially rewarding adventures and so they would encourage more trade and exploration rather than war. And castles and armor during the 100 Years' War kind of disappeared. So the feudal style of warfare, of going in with such heavy battle equipment, kind of died out. It was now the age of bow and arrow, and later guns and cannons.